Wizard's Rise, The Severed Empire Book 1. By PHILLIP Tomasso. Chapter 1. Light flashed above and behind thick clouds, as if silent war waged in the heavens. Like the cannons discharged by the voyagers, each electrical surge illuminated the raging sea, revealing growing swells. The wind blew from every direction. Harsh gusts swirled, shot upward, and crashed back down against angry black water. The Isthmian Sea was a natural boundary dividing the two remaining kingdoms of the old empire. On the west was grey ashland, and to the east, the Cordillera realm. In the center of the sea, just south of the Zenith Mountains and Crimson Falls, were the islands the voyagers called home. Captain Sebastian barked orders. Helix, the bosun, repeated them back. Searle, the captain's lieutenant, worked with the rest of the crew, raising black sails and tying them off. Some worked soundlessly, but furiously, doing what needed to be done before the storm crushed or capsized the vessel. Others shouted across the deck over the sound of crashing waves. Searle had sailed all his life. This storm was unlike any he'd ever seen. When the rain started, its salty drops pricked like bee stings against exposed flesh. A crack of lightning escaped the clouds and splintered across the sky, igniting the darkness. It sparkled as if backlit by the sun shining, illuminating shards of broken glass. A rolling growl fell from the heavens and echoed off the sea before bouncing back up to the clouds. As that thunderous rumbling faded, another blast of lightning froze for a moment in the sky, splayed like bony fingers on the hand of a skeleton. The sea danced as if giant monsters rose from the bottomless depths. Each swell threatened to crush their ship. Searle feared they'd not survive. He could not ever recall a sea so angry. The shouting across the deck had ceased. Everyone soundlessly concentrated on their job, and perhaps thought about loved ones at home. The silence didn't last. A sailor, or tar, screamed. It came from above, from the yardarm. "Man overboard!" Someone shouted. Captain Sebastian stood at the helm with two spoke handles of the ship's wheel in a death grip. His body bent to the left, using his strength and weight in an effort to hold her straight and steady. Searle, even seasoned sea legs, couldn't provide balance. As the lieutenant crossed port to starboard, searching black seas for the lost man, he held on tight as the ship rose on a wave, and even tighter as she fell. The sea slammed down from above. Holding his breath, eyes closed, he desperately grasped the railing. He saw no one in the water. It was far too dark a night, and the sea was as black as death. The storm had erupted. From nowhere, there had been no gradual change in climate. Clouds had appeared in an eye blink, and sped across the sky. They darkened, and grew thicker, heavier, as they crossed from the Reims Mountains over the Isthmian. The sun never stood a chance. The blanket of clouds brought darkness. If asked, Searle would have said, the storm appeared out of nowhere, as if by magic. And now, on deck, the captain, the crew, and Searle scrambled to save the vessel, and themselves. Wood crunched by the bow. It sounded like a giant tree snapping, and falling over. If the hull was compromised, they'd go down. On the eastern shores of the Isthmian Sea, in the Osiris realm, a massive castle sat wedged into the cliffside, and rose above the summit of the Reims Mountains. Within the center tower, the tallest, from which the Cordillera flag flew, Ida stood over flames that danced in an iron bowl, set on a tripod with polished steel legs. Only the fire and the lightning outside lit the small room. The sleeves from her long black cloak hung loose off her wrists, and swayed as she moved her hands back and forth above the blue, orange, and yellow flames. With the hood pulled over her head, the fire created dark shadows, making her face seem more alive, animated. Stray clumps of White hair framed a face of sagging gray skin, a long crooked nose, and eyes completely black set. Inside sockets knuckled like the bark of the tree. King Herman Cordillera saw what the firelight revealed, and cringed away from it. King Herman kept his distance from the witch. She frightened most people, even him, but that was not why he stayed back. He simply did not want to get in her way while she focused her magic. Familiar with her power, her antics, he knew to stay shy of those unpredictable movements. Watching intent with interest, King Herman waited. Quietly, but impatiently. He folded his arms across his chest and stared, taking in everything she did. He ground his teeth to keep from groaning when so much time had passed. He needed assurance that everything was going as planned. The storm over the sea had roiled for an hour, and all Ida had told him was that she was the one who manipulated the weather. He already knew as much. Secretly, he was fascinated by spells, by the implements of magic gathered about the room and the potions stored in bottles stashed on wooden shelves lining the rock walls. Sorcery had captivated him from the time he was young. He looked at the indistinct contents contained inside small glass jars, the unique cuts and quality of precious stones, and the colored liquids that appeared alive swirling inside those vials. Ida kept her things in cluttered disarray, filling every inch of space on each of the hundreds of mounted planks. Dust and spidery cobwebs covered everything, a sign of long-lapsed use or perhaps disinterest. It was how she worked, and she got things done. It bothered him not. Results were all that mattered. Ida backed away from the fire and lowered her head. Her arms dropped to her sides, long sleeves hiding her hands. The fire flickered. With a whoosh, the flames rose, and then went out. Only hot embers remained burning and crackling at the bottom of the iron bowl. The king could no longer see the witch's face. For that benefit, he did not mind standing in darkness. He uncrossed his arms and took one tentative step toward her. Ida? Do you have something for me? Did you see something in the flames? You did, didn't you? She was silent. He cursed. I can't be patient. Not anymore. Whatever it is. Whatever you saw, I need to know. You must tell me, now. Ida's hands went to the mouth of her hood and slowly pulled it away from her face, and to her stooped shoulders. She stood by the sole window. On a clear day she could see as far as the sea, but not across it to the grey ashland kingdom. She heard what needed hearing. She's on her way out. As soon as she uses her magic. We'll find her. King Herman felt his left eye twitch. He knew better than to doubt the sorceress. She had made predictions, shared prophetic visions. He needed events to align perfectly. This was the beginning. He didn't simply want to wage war, he wanted assurances that he would win. It's what Ida promised. She is out, then? She is. King Herman, the Mountain King as he was often called, fought the urge to smile. It was far too early to celebrate. And even too soon to smile. The storm? It is as I have said. She will sense the magic behind it. She'll tap into me and my strength. Her tone of voice was flat, monotone, annoyed at having to repeat herself. She will know I am here. And which way has she gone? King Herman hated getting ahead of himself, yet he couldn't deny the anticipation, the excitement building within. All the time spent preparing would pay off. The empire would be his. He could taste it like citrus on his tongue. That I do not know. Yet. Until she uses her magic, I am in the dark. It is just a matter of time, though. I assure you. He hated her voice, so deep and sounding of gravel grinding gravelly. It seemed to echo in the small room. No voice should echo without cause, but hers was especially disconcerting. She will know my plan? As you commanded. Once tapped into my magic, she was able to read my thoughts, because I allowed it. Ida did not hide her pride very well, she wore it like a sigil. She knows what you intend, every last detail you wanted shared. She is aware. To see her smile was painful. King Herman did not look away, though. It wasn't out of respect, but because it demonstrated his fearlessness. She didn't scare him. No one scared him. But you will be able to find her? Ida sighed, as if answering his questions annoyed her. When she uses her magic, it will shine like a beacon. For me to see. She will track down the other wizards for us. She will feel the need to protect them, to warn them, perhaps to gather them with the hopes of defeating you. King Herman shook his head, delighted. He was going to get the war he wanted. And the ship under the storm? What of it? It may be an unfortunate loss under the circumstances. Ida's arms rose and pointed her hands at the window. Her fingers twitched and bent back at an unnatural angle, while the knuckles cracked in protest. She aimed her magic out of the one window. Their fate is not yet known. They may sink, or not. King Herman watched the movements silently. There was an electric charge in the room. The hairs on his arm stood. He considered what she said. The Voyagers could prove a powerful ally. Their ships and skilled crews alone were invaluable. No matter. They would either willingly bend a knee before him, or he would break legs forcing them down. In time, the vessels and their crews would acknowledge his command. They couldn't know. The storm was his doing, yet once they learned of his army of wizards, it wouldn't be difficult. Connecting dots. Not worth worrying about now. If you can save them, save them. If not, so it goes. It has been far too long since the surrounding kingdoms were unified under a single emperor. The foolishness of rulers past had all but wiped out the use of magic, killing wizards and magicians with little regard to their usefulness. King Herman would change all of that. It began with this single wizard. He'd have his war, and rule the kingdoms without long, drawn-out battles. With magic behind him, he would rule over more than just the old empire. His power would be limitless. The lands he'd conquer countless. The idea of being unstoppable and invincible had occupied his thoughts and dreams long before his head was adorned by the royal crown. I will have my men ready to go where directed. When you have any indication of the wizard's whereabouts, I want you to tell the guard at your door. Immediately. Chapter 2. Michael didn't like the idea of leaving his grandfather alone. Although he'd had time to milk the cows, feed the livestock, and clean a few stalls in the barn, there was always more to do. Their parcel of land was outlined by a rickety wooden fence that always begged repair. The animals grazed separately in sectioned-off areas. Lush green grass grew outside the fenced perimeter. Dirt with patches of thin blades of grass, but mostly weeds, covered Michael's land within. The cattle, sheep, and horses ate dandelions, and anything green. Occasionally, he let them graze beyond the fences. It was dangerous, because that land belonged to the king, but at times necessary. Though Michael wanted to stay home and finish the chores, grandfather insisted he go. Clearing the breakfast table, Michael decided to protest one last time. I think I should stay here. There's too much to do. If we jump every time the king says jump, if you don't jump every time the king says jump, you could very well find yourself next in line to be hung. Grandfather was 72 years old, and except for bushy white eyebrows over deer-hide brown eyes, he was bald. Heavy around the middle, the loss of abdominal muscle was not grandfather's fault. His left leg was missing from above the knee. He'd been grievously injured when he raised a pitchfork fighting alongside King Nabal's army. The battle had been against an enemy that encroached from the northwest, trying to increase the size of their kingdom's footprint. King Nabal claimed an easy victory, with minimal Grey Ashland lives lost. Grandfather received nothing in return for his patriotism, for his volunteering to join the fight, and nothing for the loss of a limb. The only thanks came in the way of higher taxes to afford more knights in the king's army. Besides, I want to know the names of the men being hung this morning. Grandfather always wanted the names of those sentenced to death. I don't know why King Nabal demands villagers attend hangings. Michael set the wooden dishes and spoons inside a bucket of water on the counter under the kitchen window. He stared out of the single pane of glass. On the right was the barn and fenced property. The cows chomped at the few remaining patches of long green grass. Above, a blue, cloudless sky showed no sign of last night's storm. Hangings serve layered purposes, Michael. Grandfather pushed away from the table. Michael had replaced the legs on an oversized chair with 4 wheels, 2 big wheels in the center of the arms, and 2 smaller ones by his feet, for balance. Grandfather kept a blanket in his lap and over his legs, regardless of the temperature. It was as if the stump didn't exist if he couldn't see it. Michael turned around and leaned against the counter, his arms folded. They were muscular from long days spent working the farm, and continually repairing sections of fence. His hair was copper-colored, like the king's coin, and too long for summer weather. When not pulled back and tied off in a tail, it hung just past his shoulders. Grandfather threatened taking a knife to it while he slept if it weren't trimmed soon. It shows the people they have a just king, a ruler who will not tolerate crime. Grandfather nodded. That's right. Don't you think that's important? I do. It is important. When he hangs these men for their crimes, word will spread. No doubt. I just don't see the need to demand we all attend. I don't need to see men hung to obey laws. Michael sighed and turned back to the bucket. He quickly scrubbed a dish with a brush. If I stayed home, no one would be the wiser. If you stayed home and someone, for some reason, told someone else, you'd risk spending time in the stockade. If that happened, I'd be prone to wheel myself down to the keep and through the gates just for the pleasure of throwing rotted cabbage at your head, he said, and humphed. Michael set the clean bowl aside, and laughed. You would not. Besides, we don't grow cabbage. Oh, I wouldn't? You don't want to find out. Trust me. And for you, I'd buy old cabbage just for throwing. Now go. Get changed, Grandfather said. Changed? I just put these clothes on. Michael pulled at the waist of his tunic. Dirt and grimy handprints spotted the otherwise white fabric. You smell like pig. I work with pigs, Grandfather. Michael sniffed the air around him, as he waved his hand, wafting the scent toward his nostrils. And I believe it is more of a cow patty aroma than pig that I detect. Grandfather pointed toward the bedchamber. Do not make me ask again. Michael knew his grandfather was serious, but also having fun. Grandfather? Michael pulled off his shirt. What are the king's other reasons for forcing his people to witness hangings? There is just one other. Fear? Grandfather nodded, his lips pursed. Fear. A king wants to be both respected and feared by his people. Combined, these tend to keep uprisings to a bare minimum. Michael stuck his arms and head into a fresh tunic, but left on the same pants. They were the only cleanish ones left. He would wash laundry when he returned from the hangings. I'm going, Grandfather. Depending on how long I'm gone, I will fix a meal as soon as I return. Or would you like me to mix something up quick? I think if I get hungry while you're gone, I can make something to eat, Grandfather said, the smile gone. I'll be fine, Michael. But the names, don't forget the names, he said. Grandfather was excused from attending the hangings. His missing leg the reason. Regardless, Michael didn't think his grandfather wanted to witness the executions. I won't forget. The old man nodded. Thank you, Michael. Thank Unraveling wisps of near-transparent white shredded the blue sky. The strips of cloud sat suspended and seemingly motionless. For the end of autumn it was an unseasonably hot few weeks. Today was no different. The day's heat already apparent, it caused a mirage that resembled smears of shimmying oil on the ground further down the path. The sun was barely over the eastern horizon, and the air already felt stifling and almost too hot to breathe. Michael stopped by his favorite tree on his way to the castle. It wasn't the tallest by any means, and neither was it the strongest. Mossy growths on the bark and branches suggested the tree might be sick and dying. His grandfather had planted the tree when he first married Michael's grandmother, and they settled the land given to them by the king. He often thought about climbing to the top, imagining the view would be spectacular. He bet from up there he'd be able to see the Isthmian Sea to the east, and Nabal's castle to the west. Getting even a few feet off the ground stopped him cold. His body broke into a sweat. He'd look down and the ground would become unfocused immediately, forcing him to climb back down. Heights troubled Michael. The tree was his favorite because natural holes and folds in the bark let him hide his sword, dagger, bow and arrows. He removed his dagger from his belt and placed it safely inside the tree with his other things. He looked around, making sure no one saw. He wasn't anywhere near the cicade forest, so he wasn't worried about tree dwellers stealing his things. Those archers couldn't be trusted. The dirt path he followed fed into the main road, leading to the center of Grey Ashland, where King Nabal's castle was located. His feet kicked up small plumes. The brown cloud and stones settled onto the top of his boots. Few travelers were on the path. He did his best to blend in, walking behind a group adorned in green and red cloaks, men who used large walking sticks and carried empty wicker baskets. They reminded him of his friend Blodwin. Behind him came a wagon pulled by two horses spotted white and brown. Michael, and those in front of him, stepped aside to let the wagon pass. The previous night's storm must not have stretched this far west. Dust swirled over them in the aftermath. Michael covered his mouth and nose and coughed, fanning the air in front of his face with a few waves of his arm. He jumped back as the dirt settled. A large spider had tried to blend in with the ground and done a fine job of it, until it moved front legs and mandibles, as if also annoyed by the dust. The body of the arachnid was half the size of Michael's palm. The spread of its 8 legs made it larger than his hand. Michael held his breath. He could not think of a thing he feared more than spiders. He'd rather climb a tree than face a spider. He didn't even have the courage to step on it. He gave the multi-eyed thing wide berth, and hurried to catch up to the group ahead, wanting to get as far away from the spider as quickly as possible. A falcon soared overhead, its presence made known by a screech and caw as it circled before making its way toward the sea, in search of rodents, or any fish it could pluck from the water. Maybe after lunch he would escape for a quick swim in the Isthmian. It offered the only true relief from the heat. Moist armpits already dampened his fresh tunic. Rumors of monsters living in the sea didn't frighten him. He never outswam out far, or gone too deep though. He also fished the sea, another taboo. He caught bass or pike, which he cooked on an open flame, and ate with relish, but had yet to hook any monster. The rock wall of the keep loomed just ahead. The cicade forest had once stretched this far south many, many years ago. Long before he'd even been thought of, no doubt. Hundreds of tree stumps yet remained. Grandfather said no one removed the stumps because they served as a minor form of protection. Those attempting a siege had to contend with them as a first obstacle. There was no clear path to run at the castle walls. The only better, more defensible location might have been along a mountain face, where impenetrable was an understatement, such as the legendary castle of the Osiris realm. 2 armed guards stood at either side of the barbican, about 30 yards in front of the lowered drawbridge and raised wrought iron gate, while several marched back and forth above on the wooden walkway between crenellations within the compound. Only 2 of the 8 bastions were visible from the main road. Far to the east a third could be made out. Multiple loophole breaks in the brick and rock faced in 3 directions, south, west and east. The other bastions also had loophole breaks, facing 3 directions accordingly, as well. It took over an hour, but he'd walked the wall many times, and had seen them all. The rock structure seemed to stretch on and on without end. When standing on the outside of the keep, the walls towered above him. He had to the moat prevented enemies from running ladders up the castle walls, and rumors ran rampant about a bottom-dwelling beast swimming in circles around the castle. The monster supposedly captured from the Isthmian and dumped into the moat. Michael never saw signs of anything under the surface, not even base or pike. As the group neared the lowered bridge, Michael hurried his steps to approach with the men in cloaks. The king's guards made him apprehensive. If he weren't already sweating from the morning heat, the sight of them with steel swords at their sides, dressed in helmets and chainmail, and holding large badge-shaped shields bearing the grey ashland crest, would have started him perspiring. His footfalls echoed off the wooden bridge, and he wrinkled his nose at the stench from below where the staleness of stagnant water wafted upward. Scum and purple thistles littered the placid surface. Water spiders skimmed across the top, dodging dragonflies set on morning meals. Mosquito swarms huddled in areas behind the flowered weeds, creating a loud buzzing noise. If a monster lived below the ripple-less surface, any visible current would give such a creature's whereabouts away. There was no such indication. Entering under the spikes of the raised portcullis was uneventful, thankfully, and once inside, Michael distanced himself from the cloaked men, and made his way toward the market square. The marketplace was active, bustling with merchants, traveling vendors, and peasants begging for handouts. The encircling aisles in the middle of the fortress, and surrounding the tower, was lined with umbrella-covered carts where fresh produce and slaughtered meats were sold. The other farmers, like Michael and his grandfather, worked on small parcels of land all across the Grey Ashland Kingdom. Michael and his grandfather rarely had surplus for sale. Not to mention that prime selections of meat, dairy, and produce were paid as tax to the king. Michael wove his way toward the center of the outer keep's town. A crowd was already gathering around the stained wood of the gallows. It looked out of place as everything else was cut from stone. There were stairs leading to a raised platform, a rectangle made of beams, standing at either end, with one across the top of the 2 pillars. From that top beam dangled 4 nooses. Today, 4 men would hang for their crimes. Michael made the mistake of walking to the back side of the gallows. The men waiting to die were shackled together, one in front of the other, foot to foot, and hand to hand. Their clothing was tattered, torn, and their faces marred with jagged cuts and bruises. There was no mistaking who they were. These were not men from Grey Ashland. Their green tunics and brown pants were natural camouflage for living among the treetops. These criminals were bandits from the Cicade Forest. Chapter 3. 7 musicians lined stone steps along the southwest castle wall. A row of black horses galloped into the square. The horseshoes clapped on cobblestone, and the sound bounced off the high walls. The musicians raised trumpets. Blaring horns signaled the beginning of the execution. Michael winced, wanting to look away. Instead he found himself craning his neck to catch sight of the king. Nabal was not a terrible ruler. He seemed to care about the people. It reminded Michael of the earlier conversation with his grandfather. Nabal wanted respect and fear from his subjects. His methods seemed harsh at times, but not overly so. Rumors about dangerous thieves living in treetops throughout the Cicade forest became common stories, tales told to frighten children at bedtime, cautioning them to behave. Dressed in a white tunic, an earth-brown vest under his crimson royal cape, the king rode a powerful white stallion. Footmen rushed to help him from the saddle. The crown he wore had been crafted by a goldsmith who lived long ago, and had originally made the crown for King Grandaer, Nabal's grandfather. It was then passed to King Stilson, and finally to Nabal. The circlet held 4 white diamonds, and embedded within the triangular gold plate at the forehead sat a large square of cut, black diamond, a rare gem mined from the depths of gorge caves, beneath the Zenith Mountains to the north. King Nabal, escorted by the knights of his personal guard, proudly climbed the steps to the top of the gallows platform. He waved to the people. The people called in return. His boots thudded distinctly on wood as he strode across the impromptu stage with thumbs hooked behind a wide, tooled leather belt of deep brown. His cape billowed mildly behind with each step taken until he stopped at the front edge of the platform, and raised an arm for a final salutation. The crowd cheered in reply. Michael saw a young woman clothed in deep blue velvet with a dark purple shawl wrapped about her shoulders and pinned to her throat by a large opal brooch. Under a thickly laced headband, her blonde hair was pulled back and braided. Their eyes met. Michael looked away. The king had no daughter yet. The striking young woman possessed the air of royalty. She was poised and dignified. Beautiful as well. He had no business holding her stare, but chanced another glance. She looked at him still, her eyes wide. He shook his head, lowered it, and allowed his eyes only the dirt around his feet. He'd offended her. The last thing he wanted or needed was trouble. He debated leaving the court. He could always lie to his grandfather, claiming the king never gave the names of those hung. That wouldn't work. His grandfather would know something was amiss. The king spoke, breaking Michael's chain of thoughts. My people, we are gathered here this morning to see justice delivered. Nabal stood with fists on his hips. His voice projected across the court as if he were a lion. Rumbling. The crowd was silent, staring up at their royal leader, waiting for his next words. The select knights of my army, my watch, apprehended thieves attempting to scale our castle walls in the darkness of a moonless night. He moved about on stage, his speech a part of the entire show. For the creatures to have reached our very keep means they first had crossed into grey ashland borders, slinking past the guard patrols and watch posts. How many of you slept unaware that animals were on your land? How many of you slept under the pretense of safety, unaware just how close to death you might have been? Michael knew the people from the forest were more than Woods's people. His grandfather had alluded to the fact many were once knights, or had served the king in some way. However, the king had a valid point. He did not like the idea of these renegades sneaking into the kingdom. It was an unnerving thought. King Nabal raised a fist into the air. Countless times I warned the people of the Cicade forest not to venture outside the safety of their haunted woods. I don't fault them for coming to Grey Ashland. That, in and of itself, is no crime. The wrongness of their actions arises with the time of their arrival. Why wait until the cover of night to approach our walls? Why attempt scaling the rock, when the front gate would be lowered in the morning? He paused and looked over his people as if expecting an answer. No one spoke. The king gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Michael heard a rustling among those gathered, whispers, a shifting in the crowd, and then feet on the timber steps. He watched as the 4 criminals were led onto the platform. He stared at the slow sway of the empty nooses in the light breeze. Michael raised a hand to his neck, thumb lightly stroked skin. From the corner of his eye he saw the blonde woman staring at him. She stood a few feet behind the king. It seemed like she wouldn't, or couldn't look away. Next to Michael, several ladies huddled close wearing dirt brown pleated dresses, stained white aprons, and all were already crying with arms around each other for support. 2 looked like they wanted to rush the gallows and hug the criminals from the forest. Perhaps they knew the men sentenced? The others in the crowd moved in tight around him, everyone fretful for the best view of the hanging. Shoulder to shoulder he stood among the other commoners, feeling self-conscious because he knew he was being watched, and claustrophobic because he could not move. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth. It was difficult to swallow. He should have brought water with him. How he'd forgotten a canteen was a mystery. The walk home under an afternoon sun would prove brutal. His grandfather told him he was always going too fast and didn't spend enough time thinking and preparing. Responsibility was oftentimes learned through mistakes. My people, the king said, these men were not coming to Grey Ashland to purchase meat, cheese, or ale from the marketplace. Not in the middle of our night. They were not coming to Grey Ashland to see friends or family. Their intent was far more sinister. We are thankful to have caught them before vicious acts were committed. We are thankful to have caught them before harm was done, before any thefts were carried out. While they were each given every chance, every opportunity, to explain their purpose for the late-night visit, they have elected to give their names, but otherwise held their tongues, and remained silent about their true and sinister plans. Such silence is admission of guilt. My warnings were ignored. I have judged each one guilty. Their punishment, for what I declare a strike in cowardice against our peaceful kingdom, is death by hanging. A few gasps rose from the crowd, though it couldn't have been a surprise. Michael kept his eyes on the king. He felt the weight of the woman's attention. He knew she was still looking at him. It made small bumps rise on his skin. He wasn't going to check, though. Nope. He refused to give rein to his curiosity, seeking to avoid further embarrassment and potential trouble. 2 knights in chainmail under breastplates unshackled the 4 criminals, secured their hands behind their backs, and led them each to a noose. They placed loops over the saccade men's heads and pulled the knots tight to the back of their necks. Each of the intruders looked terrified, eyes wide, looking furiously left and right, desperate for impossible rescue. Chapped lips were barely visible beneath overgrown beards. The man on the far right urinated, the stain spreading down the front of his pants before pooling around his feet. Gary Slocum, Louis Steinman, Hadley Wonderfrost, and Thomas Blacksmith, I find you guilty of malicious intent to raid and pillage the Grey Ashland Kingdom. For your crimes I sentence each of you to death by hanging. Because you elected to hold your tongues during questioning, I forbid any last words. King Nabal nodded toward the executioner on the far right, beside the man who'd loosed his bladder. In a black hood, with leather weapons belts crisscrossing his bare and muscular chest. The executioner gripped a lever, and pulled it toward him. A trap door on the platform fell away. The 4 men dropped. Women cried out at the horror of the sight, and continued crying, perhaps from the loss of 4 lives. The ropes snapped tight. The solid crossbeam barely moaned under the weight. The men's legs kicked. Eyes bulged from sockets. The first man, Gary Slocum, was lucky. His spinal cord snapped instantly. His lifeless form dangled in the air. The acrid odor of urine was joined with that of liquefied feces that streamed from released bowels. Shit dripped off the toe of his shoe. The other three fought, dying, bucking and straining for air. Their battle lasted minutes. One by one their skin turned blue, their faces became engorged. Blood rolled like tears from eyes and ears. And then, one by one, lost the fight. The spectators became silent, and remained long after the fourth man died. Everyone, that is, except the small group of gathered women. They bellowed, and two of them dropped to their knees. The others attempted helping them up, standing in front of them, either blocking the women from a view of the bodies, or keeping them hidden from the king's eyes. Michael noticed that the blonde woman who was with the king was watching the women, and him, curiously, but when their eyes met he looked away. The knight who pulled the lever drew his sword. Michael expected the knight to sever the ropes and drop the bodies to the ground. Instead, the swords were driven into the right side of each hung man. The broadsword sawed through flesh and bone with a single thrust. Blood did not spray from the stabbings, it poured out of the wounds, fell between the boards and onto the dirt below the stage. The bodies swayed like skinned cow on hooks at the butchers. Michael had completed his duty. He'd traveled to the court for the hanging as the king demanded. He'd learned the names of the men hung, as his grandfather wanted, and now, parched and uneasy due to the woman with blonde hair's regard, he turned to start home. Peripherally, he saw her watching him still as he cut a path through the crowd. He walked quickly through the courtyard. His heart was a hammer inside his chest. He could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. No, that wasn't it. He wasn't sure how he knew, but his unease was not because something was wrong, it was because something was about to change. It was the only way he could describe it. Something was about to change. Chapter 4. Michael's grandfather rested in his chair on the front porch, his blanket still draped over his lap, his hands folded on top. Michael perched on the step in front. Silence filled the space between them for several moments. "It's going to rain," his grandfather said. "Was a pretty good storm over the sea last night. Thought for sure it would have made land. Don't think it even reached the beach. The thunder and lightning kept me awake, so I watched the sky from my room. Wasn't going to sleep, so figured, why not? It was an angry storm. One of the worst I'd seen in a while." Michael looked at the sky. "But not again today, I don't think. Another storm is coming." Michael knew the old man's leg was better at predicting weather than changes in pressure in the air, but sometimes he still opted to disagree. He stood up and clapped his hands on his thighs to pat the dust off his clothing. "There's not one cloud. In fact, I'm going down to the sea to do some fishing. Catch us some dinner. You be careful." His grandfather nodded. "Oh, and Michael, the names?" Michael sat back down. "They were men from the cicade forest." "Their names?" Grandfather said, his tone sharp. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. He pictured the king reciting the names. It refreshed his memory. Gary Slocum, Louis Steinman, Hadley Wonderfrost, and Thomas Blacksmith. Those were the men the king hung today. Their deaths were horrible. One died fast. The others refused to let go for as long as they could. I wasn't sure they'd ever pass. It wasn't anything I'd ever care to witness again. Grandfather? Grandfather didn't seem to be listening. His mouth worked like a man chewing rough steak carefully before swallowing. "Catch us a few fish. I am feeling hungry. Are you okay?" The old man smiled. "I'm fine, Michael." Michael stood and went into their house. He scooped water out of a bucket and drank from the ladle. He wiped his mouth with the back of his tunic. His fishing gear stood in the corner. He gathered his bow and tackle box and, before going back outside, snatched a green apple out of the wooden bowl on the center of the kitchen table. Outside he set his things down and knelt beside his grandfather. Why do you always want to know the names of the men put to death? They deserve to be remembered. Grandfather stared absently toward town. The king said they were caught trying to climb the castle walls. He believes they were going to steal, rape, and kill his people. How is that deserving of a memorial, grandfather? Did the men confess this to the king as their plan? Michael shook his head. The king said the men refused to talk. It is possible then that the men from the forest were trying to enter Grey Ashland for another reason entirely. In the middle of the night? It is possible, though. Isn't it, Michael? He shrugged. I suppose. But, if it is possible, then it can also be likely. Neither of us were present when the men were caught. Do we know for a fact that they were captured trying to sneak in? Were we there when they were questioned? We don't know what was asked, nor do we know what answers were given. Repeating, and perhaps remembering the names of those hung is not such an extraordinary memorial then, is it? Michael shook his head. He was missing something. His grandfather had other reasons for wanting the names of men executed. He simply couldn't figure it out. The old man was suspicious like that at times, mysterious. He thought about telling his grandfather about the young woman with the king, the way she kept staring at him. He then thought better of it as doing so might worry the old man. He was apprehensive enough about the encounter himself. There was no need for both of them to be preoccupied with something that would likely prove to be nothing. I'll be back soon, he said, lifted the tackle box and slung the fishing bow over his shoulder. Be back before the storm, grandfather said. Michael was tempted to scoff, but, sensing the old man's mood, refrained. Yes, sir. Salty sea air mingled with the flavor of sweet apple as he hiked to the Isthmian. After splashing around in the shallows to cool off, he dressed and then sat perched on the end of a jutting, natural pier of flat rocks. Michael pulled the bowstring back until the knuckle of his thumb rested against his cheek, and concentrated on the water, the thought of a hearty dinner sharpening his focus. With one eye closed, he lined up his shot, and waited. The gulls remembered him. They circled, squawking and chawking their insistent chatter overhead. Though he usually struck true, occasionally the arrow would only wound a little swimmer and the gulls would swoop in and snag the injured as a reward for their attentiveness. In order to retrieve a fish cleanly, the arrow needed to pass through the meaty part of the body. That way, when reeling the arrow in on his roll of string, he wouldn't need to worry about it tearing free from the flesh. He needed to be quick about it, as the gulls had no issues with stealing his catch. Waves crashed on the rocks around him, their white caps formed like massive fingers curling into fists. Before striking, the spray soaked his tunic, refreshing against his once again heated and sweaty skin. When he saw a large fish between waves, Michael relaxed his fingers and loosed the arrow. It flew through air and pierced water. The string was coiled beside him, one end tied around his ankle. He fit the bow over his shoulder and pulled in the slack quickly, hand over hand, until the arrow popped up out of the water without his potential prize. The shaft, made from wood of the wayfaring tree, floated despite its steel broadhead. He knocked the arrow, pulled back the bowstring, and waited for another target. There was a good chance his last arrow made skittish fish scatter. He practiced patience. They'd return. With brains the size of a pebble, their memories must be swept clean every few seconds. He kept his eyes on the water and ignored the cloudless blue sky and the sun's blinding rays. Grandfather would be wrong today. There was no chance it would rain, much less storm. When another fish stopped to graze on seaweed and plankton just below the surface, Michael aimed, thumb by his cheek. The feathers from the fletching tickled skin. As he released, and the arrow launched, he gasped in surprise. Something quite large gobbled the fish. That had been his targets. The arrow pierced the creature and it was gone. Michael quickly looked at the coiled string. Before he had a moment to react, the string was pulled taut and completely disappeared into the water. Michael was yanked from his feet. He thought he might strike his head on a rock, but was shockingly pulled through the air, over a cresting wave, and into the sea. Michael sucked in as much air as his lungs could hold before being dragged under. His thoughts went wild. He conjured up childhood images of grisly monsters from bedtime tales, frightening stories told of creatures that swum the murky depths of the Isthmian Sea. Always discounted as legend, Michael found himself forced to face facts. The head of this thing resembled nothing he had ever before seen. He had not seen its full shape, nor could he gauge the length or bulk of the body. The head alone was enough to scare him. It was triangular, like a snake's head, but much bigger, like it would fit the body of a cow. The eyes were large and black like coal. He'd seen enormous teeth, like fangs, on either side of the mouth when it had consumed his intended dinner. The large scales were purple and green, and iridescent when sunrays struck them. With his knife safely with his things on the rocks, Michael had no way of cutting the string around his ankle. The speed with which the creature swam made it impossible to reach his leg. He was being dragged too fast through the sea. He was too disoriented and surprised to even think to reach for the knife at his belt. Bubbles intermittently blinded him. They surrounded him, exploding as he passed through them. The seawater stung his eyes. He could not tell if they were diving deep, or if they remained near the surface. His lungs burned. His heartbeat hammered like heavy knocks on a wood door behind his ribs, and pulsed at his temples. And, all at once, movement stopped. He felt suspended in midair. Somewhat overcoming his confusion, he looked for the direction of bubbles rising. Michael brought his knee up, his fingers fumbling with the knot at his ankle. Using both hands, he pulled at the loop. The string was strong like wire. He had previously wheeled in fighting 20-pound fish without the string snapping. Unfortunately, the knot was now pulled far too tight from the strength at which the creature had dragged him through the sea. He refused to give up, though. His lungs felt like they might explode. He desperately needed air. He managed to wedge a finger between the string in his leg, creating a small gap, and began untying the knot. Once finally, blessedly free, he followed the bubbles toward the surface. Kicking, and sweeping his arms down, he swam as hard and as fast as he ever had. Above he saw the clear wavy veil of the surface. The water resembled moving glass. He saw through the water, though, and in the distorted view of the once clear blue sky, saw a lone dark cloud. His head broke through the surface, an unmuffled sound filled his ears. Waves crashed on rocks to his left as he pulled air into his lungs. That familiar chatter of the gulls came from overhead, and a new terror gripped him. He feared the gulls remembered the beast better than they did him. He did not want to wind up scraps for the birds to feed on. Michael tried to stop gasping for air. He wanted to breathe as normally as possible. Panicking was the last thing he needed to do. Swimming was the first. 5 dorsal fins appeared, 20, 30 yards out. Like a winding snake, the fins made their way toward him. Slowly at first, then picking up speed. Was it one creature, or 5? He had no idea. The dorsal fins disappeared. The creature had gone below the surface. Michael took a deep breath, held it, and sank under. With his eyes open, ignoring searing pain from the stinging salt, he saw it. One saving grace was immediately apparent. The arrow had impaled the creature's mouth, forcing it mostly closed. The thing opened its mouth a bit, but clearly not as wide as it could. Regardless, row upon row of jagged teeth were visible and just as sharp and deadly looking as the fangs that lined the sides of its mouth. Michael braced for the attack, knowing that there was no time to escape. He'd seen how fast it had snatched up the fish he'd targeted. The creature possessed lightning speed. The idea, good or bad, was to wrangle the head. Maybe he could use the arrow as a handhold. He'd never make it to shore. He wasn't that strong of a swimmer. Wrangle the head. That was the idea. Instead, just before the thing was close enough to bite him in two, if not for the arrow, it dove, the last fin slicing through his tunic, cutting his chest. The water turned a milky red around him. Bleeding in the water was not going to help the situation, not at all. Michael understood exactly what was happening, and thought. He felt his heart skip a beat in fear. The wounded creature could not eat him, but it could dice him up like chum. The blood, no doubt, was like a ringing triangle that signaled mealtime to other vicious sea creatures. His situation seemed hopeless. Looking down, his lungs beginning to burn. Again, he saw the creature coming up at him. Fast. In the darkness of the deeper water, he saw the swishing back and forth of its body, which efficiently powered and propelled the creature toward him. Then it rotated 180 degrees, so that the hooked, triangular dorsals lined up with Michael. The 5 fins were on the length of the one serpent. Each fin was the size of both of his hands put together. The tail swished, propelling the body of the beast. Yes, it meant to flay him, slice him up into people fillets and steaks. As the first dorsal cut into his thigh, Michael kicked out with his left leg, trying to move out of the way. Pushing off of the massive creature, he once again breached the surface, filled his lungs with air, and looked for land. Seeing the sand of the beach, he immediately raced towards the shore, his one chance at surviving this horror. He kicked his legs, his arms pinwheeled through the water, and he turned his head from side to side occasionally to take in breaths. Ahead were groups of more fins above the water, at least 20. He was swimming directly toward them, and worse, they were headed towards him. The fins were not just from one creature. There were maybe 5 different monsters in the sea. His blood had attracted more beasts. These would have no arrows impeding their maws. Nightmare images flooded his mind, keeping him from focusing his little energy left on swimming. Each kick, each stroke, brought him closer to the beach as he futilely angled away from the creatures ahead. He was tired, injured, and weak. The salt water fiercely stinging the deep lacerations. He screamed as he swam, screamed from the pain, screamed hoping someone heard, screamed because it was the only thing he could still do other than swim for his life. There were too many of them. They were too fast. He would never make it. He felt the rise of a big wave pick him up. The beach suddenly looked obtainable. Survival seemed suddenly possible. The wave white capped at one end as it rolled faster and faster toward shore. He flattened his body out like a board. It was all he could think to do. He pictured himself as driftwood and hoped he'd ride the top to safety. He did not want the wave to crash over him, force him under, pin him. If that happened, the beasts, now somewhat off to his right and behind him, would have him, and tear at his flesh with their rows and rows of teeth. Lying on the wave, he floated on top of the water and raced toward shore. As fast as those creatures were, he felt like a seagull flying through the air, like a ship sailing 100 knots across the sea. The last thing he remembered, just before the wave broke and rolled, was the barely heard snapping of teeth just behind his feet and legs, and then everything went black. Chapter 5. Michael opened his eyes. He was on the beach, his face down in the sand. Water lapped at his feet. He jumped to his knees and, on all fours, scurried as far from the sea as he possibly could before dropping back down to the ground on his chest. He coughed water from his lungs. He gagged and choked on its saltiness and spat it from of his mouth. Breathing heavily, he lifted himself onto his forearms. He was alive. That much he knew. He wasn't sure if he was in one piece. One of the creatures had been at his heels. A young girl stood there, staring at him. He recognized the blonde hair, the opal brooch. He closed his eyes. He must be hallucinating. He tried to sit up, and winced. His chest and thigh hurt. The dorsal fins had sliced him deeply. He didn't want an infection. The young woman he had hoped was a hallucination did not vanish. She still stood 100 yards away, staring at him. She didn't walk toward him, or run away. Michael got to his feet, staggering before catching his balance. Turning around and looking at the sea. Washed up on the sand was a serpent. It easily could have been one that attacked him. It had not been there before he'd been pulled into the sea. Its scaled flesh looked burnt black, as if it had been roasting on an open fire. It was dead, and cooked. He had no idea what happened to that serpent. He turned and looked at the sea, running his hands over his legs to brush away sand. They'd been real. His wound from the serpents was proof. When he turned to face the young woman, he realized how out of place she looked. The blue velvet dress was bunched around her feet and covered in dirt and wet sand. He walked toward her. Part of him expected she'd back away, or float backwards. Unreachable, as happens in dreams. Yet each step brought him closer. Her hands were folded at her belly. The lone, dark cloud he now remembered seeing through the distorted glass view below the water had multiplied many times in size and or spawned others. The near blackness threatened to occlude the sun. Grandfather was right. Again. He wasn't sure what he'd say to the young lady. Did he just introduce himself? Ask if she was lost? Ask why she was here? Or why she might be following him? Did she save him? Or had she witnessed him get nearly eaten by a mammoth sea monster? She broke the silence. Are you all right? Michael brushed sand from his pants and hands. I will be. Did you do that to that serpent? She pointed at the remains behind him. Michael looked back at charred carcass. He shook his head. Wasn't me. I have no idea what happened to that one. I didn't even believe they existed. I have been fishing here for years, and have never encountered anything like that. I always thought they were silly bedtime stories. Not anymore. I did tag one with my arrow, though. It was accidental. It pulled me into the water. I thought that was going to be it for me. He had been terrified, actually. He did not see a need to share just how afraid he had been, not with her. If anything, he hoped to impress her somehow. And you lived. She sounded surprised. Just barely, he said, maybe 20 yards from her. He stopped walking. I saw you in the courtyard with the king this morning. She nodded. Am I in trouble? Have you done something wrong? Not that I'm aware of, he said. She shook her head. I'm not here because you're in trouble. Somewhat relieved, he continued toward her. He moved slowly, each step calculated. He didn't want to frighten her, though it was her presence that scared him. Her beauty captivated him. Her golden hair, red lips and bright blue eyes mesmerized. Perhaps it was from this that his apprehension stemmed. I know it sounds presumptuous, but are you following me? Yes, she said. It does sound presumptuous. I have no need to follow you, Michael. That stopped him. You know my name? I didn't. Until I saw you today. I dreamt of you many times, she said. He almost laughed, but bit down on his tongue. You dreamt of me? She blushed. I didn't know at the time it was you I was dreaming of. She walked toward him, closing the distance until they stood almost toe to toe, and face to face. I was drawn to you, she said. It came out in a whisper. I don't understand. She shook her head. Something I can't see clearly is coming. I don't understand any of it, but I know one thing for certain. And what is that? You must stop it. Michael pointed to himself. This time he let out a snicker. I raise livestock. I'm a horrible fisherman. What can I stop? You were with the king. Have you told him this? His knights train for battle. Surely they're more prepared to defend against your premonition. Besides, I've never even held a sword. That's not true, she said. It wasn't true. Blodwin had been working with him since he was old enough to walk. The man taught him how to fight with a sword, with knives, and with his hands. He'd instructed him to never advertise his skill. It was better leaving people unaware. Who are you? I am the king's ward. I was promised to him at the time of my birth as a declaration of peace. I was daughter of King Aslam of the Evidinus realm. The Evidinus realm was gone, attacked by an unknown enemy, and burned out of existence nearly 10 years ago. No one knew what had happened. It was rumored that riders were sent from the realm in search of allies and reinforcements were never heard from. The kingdom perished alone. Michael was speaking to the last of the Evidinus people. Your Highness, he said, kneeling. Stand, she said. I am no longer royalty. There is no kingdom, no crown to inherit. I am heir to nothing. He stood, eyes closed in an attempt at warding off pain shooting up his side. You are injured. I can help you, she said, reaching out a hand. He stopped her, taking her hand in his. I'll live, he said. What can you possibly want from me, princess? I still don't understand. You will call me Karen. I am no longer a princess, she said, the bite in her words evident. It contained flavors of both bitterness, and more strongly, sorrow. She barely suppressed her pain. Her lineage wiped out, her family and subjects slaughtered while she lived in the shadows of a foreign kingdom. I don't have an answer to your question. Not yet. Michael wondered if she'd ever visited the ruins. Won't the king be looking for you? She nodded. There is a feast this evening. There is always a feast after a hanging. I'll be back long before he realizes my absence. Michael didn't know anything about feasts. His dinner had already been eaten by the Isthmian serpent. I need to be getting home. I have to check on my grandfather. I just needed to meet you. Her eyes said something different. They sparkled, even in the darkly graying skies. She could have waited, but for whatever unsaid reason, had felt compelled to do so on this day. Was that significant? He had more questions, and felt he deserved answers. He also just wanted to keep her talking. He didn't want her to leave. Not yet. It was getting late. A storm was coming. If it was like the night before and reached land this time, it could be brutal. The road from his house to the kingdom was straightforward, but that didn't mean it was always safe. He had no idea what the Cicade people were really doing inside Grey Ashland's borders. More could be about. Let me stop back to the house and drop off my fishing gear, then I will escort you home. There is no need. Just beyond the dunes I have 2 armed knights on horseback. They are men I trust with my life, and with this secret. What secret? You. She sighed. We will meet again. Michael. I felt it important for us to meet before then, so when I come to you, you will not be frightened. Frightened? The king's ward knew who he was, and expected him to do something. Why would he be frightened? Surprised, certainly. Curious, absolutely. Still wet from the sea, it masked the beads of sweat forming on his brow. How was he considered a secret? Who was the secret from? Who else knew the truth? When will we meet again? The wind picked up loose sand and blew it around. I'm not exactly sure, but soon, I suspect. Soon, he hoped. And when you find me the second time, I'm to help you? No. You've got it backwards. I'm here to help you. You may be the only one who can save the old empire, she said, as she turned and walked up the dune, and beyond. Though Michael could not take his eyes off of her, she had continued on without looking back once. Wait. Save the old empire? Michael rushed home, his gear banging against his leg, his wounds throbbing. The loose items inside the tackle box rattled and bounced. He wore his bow on his back, the string across his shoulder. The bleeding on his legs and chest had slowed. The bleeding wouldn't stop until the wounds had a chance to close. Moving around prevented that. The areas were sore and gross to see. He wanted to get home fast and fetch fresh water from the well. He worried even a thorough cleaning of his wounds wouldn't stop an infection. It appeared his grandfather still sat in his chair on the front porch. As Michael got closer, he realized that it wasn't his grandfather. He quickened his pace, excited. The man on the front porch wore a tan tunic under a dark green cloak, the hood down. Long, thin black hair hung to just above the center of his chest. His matching facial hair consisted of bushy, overgrown eyebrows, the arms of a mustache that fell past the corners of his chin, and were tied at the ends with little bits of string. The chin hair was also long and thick, and braided. Blodwen's cedar staff shod with iron was 6 feet long, and leaning against the porch railing. He grabbed it as he got to his feet. Michael? You've been hurt, he said. It's nothing. We need to talk, Michael said. Blodwen furrowed his brow. Have you been fishing? Michael set down his tackle box and removed the bow from his back. If you want to call it that. Listen, we need to clean those wounds right away, Blodwen said. He spent a moment eyeing every inch of Michael, searching for additional cuts not clearly visible. He spun Michael around and lifted the back of his tunic. Stop that. I'm okay, I tell you. Michael set down his bow by the box. He knew the cuts were bad. It was perfect timing. Blodwen was here. He'd planned to call on him after dinner. Now, he didn't have to track the man down. These look quite serious, he said. Can it wait? Just a few moments? I really need to talk to you. There was this young woman I met today. I am not sure I know exactly who she is, or what she wants, or why she followed me, but she told me, fetch water from the well, he said. We'll talk about this mysterious woman after. Right now, you grab the water and I'll get prepared inside. Prepared? What are we preparing for? I've seen those type of cuts before. You were in the Isthmian, weren't you? How many times have I told you not to swim that water? No one swam in the sea. I was. But not by choice, this time. There are copious amounts of poison inside your body, Michael. Copious? Big word. Not at all amused, Blodwen said. I hope for your sake. This just happened. If too much time has lapsed, the consequences could be irreversible. Blodwen always made everything sound desperate and dire. Fire and brimstone. The man thrived on imaginary danger. A good man, perhaps even a great man, but he's always been a little overdramatic. I don't know how much time has passed, Blodwen, but it couldn't have happened too long ago, he said. He closed his eyes for a moment. It felt like his brain had become dislodged inside his skull. Despite the ever-increasing clouds, what little natural light remained hurt his eyes. Go and lie down. I'll fetch the well water. He held out a hand. There was a sudden sharp pain behind his eyes. Rubbing his temples didn't help. His clothing reeked of the sea. All he smelled was salt and fish. He wanted out of his clothing. He didn't think he could remove them without tipping over. He moved his hands away from his head and held them out to keep from falling. I'm okay, Win. Really? Because you don't look okay, he said. His hand grabbed Michael's forearm, catching him before he toppled forward. The door opened. Grandfather was at the threshold. What's going on? Michael, what's wrong? He's been cut multiple times. The dorsal fins of an isthmian serpent are deadly. It is meant to incapacitate prey much larger than the beats so they can devour it without wasting energy fighting. How he's still alive right now is beyond me. It isn't like a serpent to carve up its meal and then allow it to escape. Let me get him to his bed. We have to act quickly. Isolating the poison is all but impossible now. The best we can hope to do is counter the negative effects and neutralize it from doing damage. I'm okay, grandfather. I'm just numb, Michael mumbled. He touched his hand to his face. But, I can't feel my tongue. Or my lips. Grandfather looked at Blodwin and cocked his head to the side. What did he say? I'm not positive. We need to get him inside, Blodwin said. It's going to be okay, Michael, grandfather said. I can't feel my arms, Michael thought he said, yet hadn't heard his voice. I can't feel my arms. He realized he wasn't actually talking. The words formed inside his mind. He couldn't get his tongue to move. Or his mouth to open. Chapter 6. The Mountain King sat at the end of a 20-foot-long table. Clawed feet at the end of thick legs gripped the floor. Pointed arches along the undersides ran its length. His high-backed chair was solid mahogany, kiln-dried, and finished with a dull brown polish. The king's sigil was carved into the back frame above the burgundy leather cushion, and spires rose like castle towers. To either side, Queen Corazon sat across from him, a matching chair for comfort and prestige, and his princesses at their mothers' sides. He felt an outsider in his own castle. He watched them eat and whisper, unable to hear a single word of their hushed conversation. They weren't whispering to exclude him. They whispered because they all sat close together and there was little reason to talk above a whisper. Long ago he'd thought of ordering all three to sit closer to him. Then he considered having just his daughters near him. Instead, he did nothing. He was not going to force his family to be next to him. If they wanted to sit at the opposite end of the table and ignore him, so be it. His irritated feelings did nothing more than ripen, fester, and spoil, becoming a diverticulitis of the mind and soul. The temptation to throw grapes and pieces of sliced turkey at them grew as they giggled, especially when they didn't show the common courtesy of including him. He refrained if only because he was hungry and the cook's gravy coated the meat so evenly. Throwing food across the room would be a waste. The meal was so good he didn't even want leftovers scraped into bowls for the royal hounds. Tall stained glass windows graced the western wall of his dining hall. Sunlight filtered in through the array of sectioned colors, playing across the room and giving everything a patchwork reddish-orange and greenish-blue glow. Except during storms. When the sky was black, the palace was so dark that often torches seemed useless against the shadows. King Herman Cordillera preferred the gray. The drab blocks of the stone walls and slabs on the floor were color enough. The outside of the castle was lighter gray than the charcoal rock of the mountain. Even the banners hanging everywhere inside the castle, the Cordillera sigil displayed on tightly woven silk cloth, detracted from the peace he found in the solidarity of gray surrounding him. The king held up his chalice. The cup-bearer stepped forward, poured more wine. "Sire," he said, and stepped back, away from the table. King Cordillera drank the vintage in gulps, leaned back in his chair, and never looked away from his family. Was there a time he cared for his wife? In her youth she was pretty, he supposed, with long auburn hair, and small waist. Her breasts had been full, and her legs shapely and long. She had never lost the weight gained during each pregnancy, however, and there had been more than the two. There had been a miscarriage after the birth of Rahel, and a stillborn after Sarah. That had been his boy and heir to the throne. The weight gain wouldn't matter so much if he didn't also loathe her as a person. Not a single redeeming quality remained once the lusciousness of her form had passed. He wasn't sure why she was such a bitter woman. She came from a kingdom of nothingness. In his Osiris realm, he'd showered her in wealth. Her largest complaint was isolation. It didn't matter to her that the Reims Mountains were a natural and nigh impenetrable barrier. An enemy could attempt to scale the jagged cliffs, but his guards would spot them long before any damage could be inflicted, before any breach essayed, and they'd be knocked from the face as easily as a stone could be nudged from the ramparts. The Reims were perhaps the sole reason. The kingdom had never been under siege, never mind the strength of the fortress itself. Other nations easily understood the folly of any attack, just not his wife. The chamberlain entered the hall. "Sire, forgive me for disrupting your meal." Cordillera set his cup down, snapped his fingers at the cupbearer. He wanted more wine. "The disruption is most welcome." The chamberlain stood aside and waited while the cupbearer refilled the chalice. He cleared his throat. "The knight guarding Ida's tower. He indicates that she has summoned you." "She summoned me?" Herman Cordillera poked a finger at his chest, ready to yell and knock things off the table, but stopped himself. In all the years Ida's been in the tower, she had never once sent for him. She had found something. He had been patient. He didn't want to get his hopes up. The wizard must have used magic. Did she give an indication what this was in relation to? The chamberlain shook his head. He held a red velvet hat in his hands, and turned it over. "Just that. You were the only one she would talk to, sire." She refused to answer a single question. "I came for you immediately. I did not want to disturb your dinner, but neither did I want to wait. I knew. This must be important, sire." Cordillera drank the wine. He held the cup in one hand, and picked at food in his teeth with the pinky on his other. Pushing away from the table, he slapped a hand on the wood. The queen and his two princesses looked up. It was as if they had forgotten anyone else was in the hall. Their meals, and whispering, were momentarily halted. "I regret to inform you that I must attend to urgent matters and that you will be forced to enjoy the rest of your meal without me." Sarcasm was wasted on the queen. The children were 10 and 8. Unfortunately, they were spitting images of their mother after the weight gain. Like her, they spent the days grazing. Food was her priority, and now it was theirs as well. If they understood the wit thrown at them, they gave no sign. It seemed his vitriol was also wasted on his offspring. He wanted a son desperately, but was torn. Coupling with the fat queen repulsed him. He felt no guilt in wishing that she suffer some dangerously unavoidable fate. Accidentally, of course. The only thing that prevented him from ensuring such was the princesses. They did seem to love their mother, though he couldn't imagine why. He snatched a large hunk of white meat from his plate, and stormed out of the dining hall, chamberlain in tow. He walked proudly, chest puffed, head held high. He cherished the halls, and loved the echo his footfalls produced as he strode across the stone floors. With his palace having been built on the side of a mountain, he didn't have the luxury of spreading out over acres of land. His castle went into the sky, and was often in with low hanging clouds. It also went down into the belly of the mountain. Many of the halls were actually caves covered over with cinder walls. Import and export of supplies and goods was straightforward. The shipments were received and sent out of the fjord range, where the king kept a fleet of vessels, despite the voyagers' claim on the sea. However, he rarely sailed his ships. There hadn't been a need in the past. There may be a need in the near future, though. The foundation was constructed on the plateau of one mountain top, and backed up directly into the rise of another. peak. From a distance the castle blended with the rocky terrain. If you didn't know the castle was there, you might never spot it amidst the rocks. Once you recognized it, you couldn't look away. It was magnificent. The castle was sleek, narrow and tall with 6 towers, each fit with its own bartizan that contained machicolated floors, designed to allow rocks or boiling oil to be cast upon enemies foolish enough to climb the mountain with malicious intent. There were additional such defenses along the parapets that led from tower to tower to tower. Ignoring the salutations of those he passed, Cordillera tore into the hunk of turkey, gravy dripping to his chin. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, and then ate the remaining meat in a bite. All the while his mind ran wild with possibilities. At his behest, Ida focused her energy on tracking down wizards. They existed, but where? He knew the stories. During Emperor Henry Rye's rule, King Grondair had unleashed his watch, warriors specifically trained to hunt and destroy those that wielded witchcraft. The large numbers overpowered even the most skilled wizard. Their magic proved to have limits. The spells and incantations were oftentimes too little, too late against a charging army. An arrow in the heart, or a chopping swing of a sword that left a head decapitated from the body was as deadly to someone using magic, as it was to a mortal. The ensuing slaughter had been perceived as justified and right and reached across all kingdoms under the empire. To the Mountain King, fear of the unknown and blind ignorance was what it had actually been. Destroy what you don't understand. During dark times dark things were often handled darkly. That was simple truth, and a shameful waste. There had been books in his library penned by fools who claimed to know where wizards hid, and the number that still walked the lands. Cordillera had sent knights, not to the locations outlined, but to track down the authors of these works. Under questioning, with very little persuasion, the writers admitted to crafting fiction published as fact. Disgusted by their ruse, he had each individual summarily executed. Who had time for made-up stories? They did not educate or entertain. The volumes were removed and burned along with the bodies of their authors. There were no windows inside the towers, only slits from which archers could fire if needed. An iron bowl with burning coals sat on every third step of the spiraling staircase. The flames within these braziers created flickering shadows that grew, shrank, and multiplied like childhood nightmares dancing along the walls. Cordillera despised this particular tower most of all. He didn't consider why he had chosen it for Ida, if he even knew. Climbing the stairs was never easy. His thoughts always took him back in time. When his father was alive, he used the chamber at the top of the tower to punish him. Usually the king's majordomo carried him up the stairs by the scruff of his neck, Herman's feet kicking in lame attempt to find purchase. He would never forget the mechanical click of the king's key-turning tumblers in the door's lock, and the protest of rusted hinges whining as the door was opened. His father never beat him, but without word would lock him away for days in the tower. In the tower he received no food, and not even a bucket to use as privy. There was just the one window out of which he could watch the sun and moon battle for placement in the sky. He would relieve himself out of it as well. The crisscrossing iron bars prevented him from doing anything more. This was the only room in all of the towers without a machicolated floor. Before being released, the head of household would drop off a bucket filled with soapy water. He was expected to collect feces and scrub the floors clean. Finally able to escape the horrid stench in which he had been forced to live. A beating would have been better. He would rather a few good swats for sins committed, and then be able to move forward. Initially there would be pain. The king's hands had been big, strong, as if he'd spent his days with steel smiths hammering out imperfections in swords, instead of sitting behind mahogany desks and barking commands. The silence and isolation of the solitary confinement extended beyond the days spent locked in the tower. That emotional pain, always present, ruined his entire childhood. But, in his mind, he refused to let it sour the rest of his life. King Cordillera carried the same ring of keys his father had carried. They were tied to his belt, but wrapped in thin cloth which kept them from rattling as he walked. He didn't need to search through the keys for the one to the tower door. It didn't look any different from the others. He knew it by touch. The king always assigned a knight to guard the room, who acknowledged the king and stepped aside as the king unlocked and pulled open the door. "Sire?" the chamberlain said. He knew the man craved praise. Or at the very least, approval. It was as obvious on the man's face as it is the royal hounds when they begged for scraps. Just like the hounds wouldn't get a morsel of turkey with gravy tonight, neither would this man get a thank you for meeting his responsibilities as chamberlain. "You can return," Cordillera said. Ida stood near the bars across the window. Thankfully, her hood was covering her hideous head, and keeping her face where it belonged. In shadow, a putrid aroma filled the room. Cordillera knew it came from a mixture of the herbs in ingredients Ida kept for her magic, as well as from the witch's flesh. She disliked water, bathed infrequently, and was going to force him to command that she cleanse the stench from her body. Thick black candles sat on flat plates set around the room. The sun was, thankfully, setting on a relentlessly hot day. As long as the clouds thinned, the heat could escape in the breeze of the sea might provide a reprieve from the humidity. Autumn was ending soon. Winter would fall on the kingdoms fast. Then the cold would be what they were forced to deal with. There was no winning. When it came to weather, King Cordillera stood still, and did not announce his presence. She had summoned him. Surely she'd heard the heavy door open when the hinges squeaked. It didn't take magic for ears to work. It did take insolence to ignore royalty. He knew she thought she was different than his other subjects, that her magic made her better than most. But she was no queen. He allowed her silence for a moment longer. Her power did frighten him, he just didn't want her to know how much. It was also important letting her believe she was more than a prisoner. More than the tool he'd use to get the things he wanted. In preparing for the war, her role was essential. She knew as much, and it was where her insolence stemmed from, unfortunately. Did she know she was a prisoner? Of course she did. The locked door was more than proof enough. Even his half-witted wife would know she was being held against her will if locked inside a room. He had never mentioned to Ida the extent of her captivity, and she never questioned it. The arrangement was transparent. He was king, and she served him under lock and key. Quite simple, actually. Quite simple, and yet he sometimes wondered how he'd respond if she ever demanded freedom, or worse, threatened it. Her magic was strong, even though she was a lone witch. He knew the room was enchanted. The spell cast was straightforward, but unbreakable. It sealed the entire room, keeping a wizard locked inside, a dungeon amidst the clouds. When he'd brought Ida to his keep, and led her up the winding tower staircase, he thought for sure she'd recognize the magic. The promise of her own room where she was free to work her spells, potions, and live mostly undisturbed, apparently appealed to her. The enchantment, the lock, the key, she had not seemed to anticipate. Or had she? He'd not lied. She was encouraged to work on spells and potions. Just not as freely as she might have originally thought. The magic created was dictated by him. He had a library of books on magic. His collection had become extensive, and had taken time to acquire. The plans made would require many things to happen. Everything needed to fall perfectly in place if he expected to succeed. And he did expect success. They talked through what he expected a potion to do, expressed what he hoped, and wanted the magic to accomplish, and she worked to make it happen. Her trials weren't always fruitful or quick. Getting things right took time. Patience and time. When Ida spoke, it was softly. Her words lightly bounced off the rock walls. There has been a disturbance. Magic has been used. And the potions? He wrung his hands together. It was the first small taste of victory to reach his tongue, and he salivated at its possibilities. She waved a hand in the air. They're ready. They've been ready. And do you have a location? He said. Not specifically. I am thinking it happened on the West Bank. But I am not yet positive. More magic will be used. And when it is, I will have more accurate information. I simply wanted you made aware. We're getting closer. Keep me posted. Night or day. Anytime you have something new, I want to know, he said, before turning to leave. Chapter 7. Michael lay on the bed, his eyes open, but seemed to stare at nothing. Is he breathing? Grandfather said. His chair was parked beside the bed. He held his grandson's hand in his own. Blodwin quickly cleared items off the nightstand, and set down his small leather bag. He loosened the purse strings and dug inside. He's breathing. It's shallow, but he is breathing. His body has slipped into shock. We need more blankets. He must be kept warm. Grandfather wheeled himself out of the room in search of blankets. Someone knocked on the front door. We can't be disturbed, Blodwin shouted. He lifted a clear jar from the bag and held it up to the candlelight. It had a piece of leather tied over the mouth as a lid, and was filled with bugs, like tiny creatures that resembled insect-sized lobster tails. Send whoever it is away. He needs to heal himself. It was a woman's voice. Blodwin glanced over his shoulder, ready to order the intruder out of the house. Her presence caught him off guard. Before him stood a woman, and aside from a purple gem hanging from a silver necklace, she was naked and stunningly beautiful. Her hair was green like blades of grass, curly, and hung just below her breasts. Her flawless skin was creamy pale, but it was her violet eyes with sapphire rims and black irises that held his stare. Grandfather sat behind her at the bedchamber threshold, blankets piled atop his lap. I tried to tell her to leave. We've no time to argue. The blankets. Quickly, Blodwin said, his eyes on the woman, as he held out his hand. The woman took the blankets from Grandfather, walked into the room, and handed them over. He needs to heal himself. You must be the mysterious woman Michael met this afternoon. Blodwin unfolded the blankets over Michael's body, and then untied the string, removing the leather lid from the jar. What are those? Grandfather said. He tucked the blankets around his grandson's feet. Blodwin scooped bugs from the jar and hovered over Michael for a moment before dropping a few of the insects into Michael's mouth. These are Simathoa tongue biters. You most often find them living inside the mouths of fish. They're parasites. They attach themselves to a fish's tongue and suck blood from their host. They can grow quite large. The ones in this jar are an inch long or less. In the sea they can grow several feet. They are most difficult to remove. Eventually the host's tongue will die and fall away, and the Simathoa will act as the new tongue for the fish. Grandfather grunted, then groaned. Why on earth are you putting them in my grandson's mouth? The poison from the cuts is traveling through his body. The more poison that reaches his brain, the more dangerous his infection becomes. These tongue biters will interfere with the blood flow and ingest the poison, Blodwin said. He needs to heal himself, the naked woman said. Please, I have no idea who you are. I am not sure why you are Here. This young boy needs medical attention. His life is in serious danger. Serious danger. You're not helping the situation at all. I am going to have to ask you to leave, Blodwin said. He'd raised his voice, and seemed uncomfortable with having done so. He was unable to keep eye contact, but looking anywhere else seemed inappropriate. Now please, let us be. I am trying to save my friend's life. How long will it take to work? Grandfather pointed at Blodwin's jar. We may have to wait until morning before we notice much of a change. Blodwin rested a hand on Michael's shoulder. One way or the other, we will know something by morning. Michael, the woman said. You must heal yourself. I know you hear me. You can rid your body of the poison inside your blood. You do not need parasites to cleanse you. You can just as easily, that is enough. Blodwin put out his hands. He spun the woman around. You must leave. But what if she's right? It was grandfather. Blodwin bit down on his upper lip. Who are you? He said to the woman. My name's Galatia. Blodwin's brow furrowed. He eyed the naked woman suspiciously. She was either lying, or cared nothing for Grey Ashland law. King Grondair had launched a war against magic, executing wizards across the empire, back when there was a united empire. The decree held sway from king to king, continuing the outlaw of magic, with substantial rewards offered for information that led to the capture of anyone caught using magic or claiming to be a wizard. Galatia, the wizard? He said. She cocked her head to one side. You've heard of me? He had heard of one named Galatia. I know of her. Most do. She perished nearly 2 centuries ago at the hands of kind Grondair. The woman winced as though Blodwin's words had cut her with sharpened steel edges. That man cannot still be on the throne? Blodwin slowly shook his head. He's not. His grandson is king. You want us to believe you're the same Galatia from 200 years ago? In the flesh. She held her arms out, palms up, as if announcing, here I am. Now, unless you feel a pressing need to ask more questions, I would like to return to Michael's room. I need to speak with him some more. But he can't hear you, grandfather said. Yes, he can. He can hear everything we've said. Blodwin was correct in assessing the danger of the Isthmian serpent's dorsal. The poison, even in small doses, can be lethal. What the poison does is paralyze prey. They become like a log, unable to move limbs and muscles. His eyes are open, so trust me, he can see. He can also hear, which is why I need to continue speaking to him. Do I have your permission to do so? Blodwin saw conflict in grandfather's eyes. If word got out Galatia was inside his house, the king would send knights and have the old man arrested. In the dungeons grandfather would be tortured. The dungeon master would force a confession that both he and Michael were also using magic. They would be put to death in the courtyard for all of Grey Ashland to witness. You already know. You can trust me in this. You have my word, no one will know, Blodwin said to grandfather. What happens tonight will stay between us. You remain a good friend, Win. You have always been loyal to this family. I thought for sure when my daughter-in-law was taken, and my son ran off, I'd have seen the last of you. Instead, you've remained a part of Michael's life as though a blood relative. For that, I have always felt gratitude, grandfather said. Blodwin kept too many secrets to be completely truthful with the old man. It was expedient to accept the compliment and move forward. Thank you, sir. Being a part of your lives has been a blessing to me. And the boy? May I? Galatia said. I do not think we've much time before his life is too far gone to save. Blodwin nodded his approval. How is he going to heal himself? Grandfather said. He looked shaken, his head wobbled and lips trembled. Why do she keep saying that? I don't understand. I don't know what she's talking about. Blodwin sat in the main room with grandfather. Galatia was with Michael in his room. While he'd rather be in there, a witness to whatever happened, he knew grandfather needed him more at the moment. The man deserved answers. You know something, Blodwin. There's no need in denying it. I saw it in your eyes. Tonight. More than once. Grandfather sat rigid in his chair. His fingers laced, knuckles white. His mouth kept working even after he stopped speaking, as if there was more he wanted to say. Outside, thunder rumbled over the Isthmian. The storm would strike soon. As the rain began to fall, the intermittent drops sounded like a box of carpenter nails being erratically emptied onto the cabin's tin roof. It then transitioned into a steadier din. It's really coming down now, Blodwin said. Please, grandfather said. My grandson is all I have left. He is my only family. I can't lose him. I can't. There's only so much an old man's heart can take. Blodwin sat on a chair facing the old man, gripping with both hands the staff between his legs. He kept an ear focused on the woman's voice, her words just barely audible to his attuned hearing. I knew your daughter-in-law before she fell in love with your son. You did? You knew Anna before my son? Michael's grandfather looked uneasy. He shifted his weight in his chair. His hands unclasped and fidgeted with the blanket over his legs. He lifted it, and replaced it on his lap, tucking one end around his stump. I knew Anna, and Anna's family quite well. Blodwin didn't want to lie. He knew some things needed revealing. He didn't want to volunteer more than necessary. He feared it would be near impossible to keep secrets much longer. Though, getting answers to questions didn't always make things better. Ignorance was sometimes preferable to knowledge. The toughest thing was to convince those who didn't have specific knowledge, that they truly did not want it, that they would be happier left in the dark. Were you a part of her family? Blodwin shook his head. I was not related. I was her teacher. He could see grandfather slowly absorb that bit of information. He knew inside the old man's brain. Wheels turned like those on his chair, trying to get from one place to another. There couldn't be enough pieces in place for grandfather to get there yet, but it wouldn't take much more. Michael and Blodwin had spent time together nearly every day, rarely missing a single one, since the day Michael had been born. Teacher? I don't understand. Blodwin leaned forward. He knew that, except for Galatia and Michael, they were alone inside the house, and that the steadily falling rain and occasional crash of thunder would drown out the sound of his voice should anyone be nearby to listen. Still, he felt uncomfortable speaking above a whisper. There were the rumors, he said. There are always rumors, grandfather said. Anna, your daughter-in-law, was like Galatia. Grandfather, who seemed to have been holding his breath, sighed. He sat back in his wheeled chair and laughed. Blodwin retained his grip on his staff, but never blinked, and never looked away from the other man's eyes. It didn't take long before the weight of his words overwhelmed grandfather's mirth. The old man's shoulders began to shake. The tears brimmed from his bottom eyelids. Edric's Anna? She really did know magic? She was a wizard, Blodwin said. It somehow still surprised him that such news could bring devastation to some people. Although it shouldn't, considering the laws still around against such things. One could choose to practice magic, but such learning was limited. Students of magic focused their studies perfecting one element of the craft. The books provided insight and guidelines. Magic could be learned, and used by those born without the spark, but was not nearly as effective or as dangerous as most suspected, or as King Grandair once feared. Wizards were different. Wizards were born. One couldn't choose to become a wizard. Don't let that diminish your memory of the woman, Blodwin said. Grandfather licked dry lips. I just don't know how I was blind to it. I feel Like it's something I should have known, should have been able to detect. She was skilled at keeping her abilities secret. She knew revealing who she was, what she was, endangered everyone she loved and cared about. She rarely used her powers. Edric? He knew. And you? Are you a wizard? Finally, Blodwyn was able to laugh. I am not a wizard. I know very little about how magic works. He stood up. Perhaps I should make some tea. I believe none of us will get any sleep tonight. We might as well have some caffeine to assist us through the vigil. Yes. That sounds good, Grandfather said. Blodwyn didn't need to be told where anything was. He was as comfortable in Grandfather's house as he was his own. You said you were Anna's teacher. If it wasn't magic you taught, then what? Grandfather whispered the word, magic, as if it were part of an evil curse, and saying it out loud would inflict damage on anyone close enough to hear. The eradication King Grandair started may have ended long ago. But the crusade against magic and wizards was an ongoing one, even still to this day. King Grandair created a special and of the most elite knights and called them the Watch. Their sole purpose was to travel across the kingdom in search of people with powers. They were given full reign over their finds. They could arrest, try, sentence, and carry out an execution. No one would question their actions, unless they wanted trouble. There had been stories of people falsely accused of magic. It became something of an epidemic at one point. Few were safe from the pointing of a finger, or the whisper in a tavern. If the Watch caught wind, either accidentally, or on purpose, their terror over the land was unleashed. Making a spectacle of their proceedings was how they operated. They thrived on fear. Grandair's son, King Stilson, hosted many similar hunts, and sent his knights to the other realms under the old empire. Their sole purpose was flushing out magicians and wizards. King Nabal has done the same. Anytime there is even a rumor of magic, Nabal reacts with a show of force to apprehend and eliminate the threat. You won't see wizards being hung in the court. Nabal doesn't want anything magic inside his kingdom's borders, or anywhere in the old empire at all if he can help it. He doesn't even want people realizing it still exists. He, like his grandfather, declared that anyone who practices magic to even heal illness would be considered as guilty as a murderer. Like I said, the Watch act as judge and executioner on the road. The further away from Grey Ashland, the better. But you know all of this. We're not that different in age. We've seen our share of bloodshed, both justified and otherwise. Blodwyn lit a flame under the iron rack and set a water-filled kettle above it. I was hired by Anna's parents to protect her from such crusaders, and to do more than that. More? I taught her to defend herself without the use of magic, Blodwyn said. He removed 2 mugs from a cupboard and set them by the kettle. She learned how to handle staff, sword, and knives. She learned how to fight using her hands, her feet, her teeth, and most importantly her mind. How to think her way out of situations that seemed dire. I have done the same these last 17 years. With Michael. At Anna's request. Grandfather nodded. Although he didn't yawn, the dark bags under his eyes showed how tired the man was. That's why Michael keeps his weapons stashed in some old tree. You know about the tree? He laughed. Of course I know about the tree. Figured he's a boy. Who doesn't want a sword, and daggers? Only thing he's ever shown me is that bow of his. Because it's practical, I suppose. Blodwyn waited. If Grandfather had more questions, required more clarification, he'd ask. Otherwise, enough pieces of the puzzle had been provided. Filling the mugs with grass tea, Blodwyn offered one to Grandfather. Thank you, he said, taking the offered mug. He cupped it in both hands, as if soothing a chill in his bones. And Michael, he inherited his mother's gift? I hadn't seen any sign to indicate it. He's never demonstrated any extraordinary abilities. Everything he's accomplished appears to have been without the use of magic. He's a fine young man. Strong, brave. You should be proud, Blodwyn said. But you think he is also a wizard? Grandfather said. I am not certain. I have kept a close eye on him. I've watched for any sign that might indicate he possessed such power. I'm being honest with you when I say he has never exhibited so much as magical sneeze in front of me. Nor has he come to me perplexed by something odd that may have happened. Anna, for example, would lose her temper, normal tantrums any teenager might throw. Except that when she did, vases would shatter around her, or tables would tip. He sipped his grass tea and cringed. It burned his tongue. He blew on the tea as he sat back in his chair, across from the older man. She didn't willfully destroy things. She just hadn't yet learned to harness her emotions, or how to control her abilities. The magic was always in her, but like any talent, she was required to religiously practice and continually hone the skill. It was imperative she do so. Otherwise, by the time she reached adulthood, she'd have been a danger to, not just herself but those around her. You said you didn't think Michael was a wizard until tonight. Why is tonight different? Grandfather hadn't taken a sip of his tea. Blodwyn suspected the tea would go cold, and be left on the table forgotten. It served as a prop, something he could do with his hands. Galatia may not be everything she claims. I haven't decided if I trust her just yet. There is something about her, though. It makes me wonder. I'm inclined to believe most of what she is saying, but I am reserved, he said. More truths. I don't know where she's been all these years. Hiding, no doubt. Times were different back then. Emperor Rai was in charge of 4 kingdoms united as one. King Grandair was Rai's favorite among the monarchs, and after the death of his son, was sometimes given too much freedom to do as he wished. Everything is different now. 2 of the kingdoms are completely gone, and as you know, the Osiris realm is across the sea, but always a viable threat to our way of life. So, I am not sure why she's chosen to come out of hiding now, to make herself known to us today. It makes me wonder if she has been close all along, perhaps in the shadows watching events unfold? Has she, like me, been keeping an eye on Michael for some time? You have questions, too, Grandfather said. It was a statement. Blodwyn nodded and allowed himself a thin smile. I do. And like you, I am somewhat fearful of the truths which might be uncovered. What I do know, without even speaking to Galatia again, is that everything is about to change. There is something unnatural about coincidences. I don't believe in them. It was silent in Michael's room. His conversation with Grandfather had been so involved that he could not recall the last time he'd heard Galatia speaking. Curiosity ate at his insides like a dog gnawing on a bone. He desperately wanted to join them and see and hear what was taking place. Giving the sorcerer time alone with Michael wasn't easy. He walked over to the door and listened, before opening the door. Inside, Galatia stood by the foot of the bed. Michael's body was covered in a sheen of sweat, but he was safe. He let that be enough for now. He gently closed the door and returned to the table. He tried to settle down and relax. Anxiety served no purpose. Whatever had happened behind the closed door was done, it seemed. All that was left was the waiting. Something must be coming, but how do we prepare for the unknown? I want to be honest with you, Grandfather, Blodwyn said. Knowing Anna is a wizard, and with the arrival of Galatia, Blodwyn had little doubt. Michael is a wizard.